Welcome to the debate. Imagine waking up after like 8 hours of perfect, uninterrupted sleep. You open your eyes, the room is quiet, the sun is just coming up, but before your feet even touch the floor, you feel completely exhausted,
Oh, I know that feeling all too well.
right? And you aren't physically tired. Your mental battery is just being actively drained by background applications from yesterday that you never actually closed.
That is such a universal, visceral experience. I mean, you're lying there and your brain is instantly running that unresolved argument with a colleague or the anxiety about a looming deadline
Exactly.
or even just, guilt over a habit you didn't stick to. Experientially, it feels exactly like you've just woken up into yesterday part two.
Yeah, yesterday part two. And that heavy, stuck feeling is exactly where we are anchoring our discussion today. We are exploring the mechanics of personal transformation. Like, how do we actually overcome that persistent paralysis in our lives?
Right. And our source material today dives deep into the psychology of habits, the reality of burnout, and the hidden costs of inaction.
It does. But it also surfaces this really sharp dividing line about the fundamental catalyst for meaningful change. I hold the position that progress is primarily driven by internal cognitive recognition, meaning you must deliberately shift how you perceive and value your own efforts before your behavior can sustainably change.
And I take the contrasting perspective based on this material. I argue that behavioral interruption, like forcing new physical actions regardless of your internal emotional state, has to precede any meaningful internal shift. You cannot simply think your way into a new life.
Well, you certainly can't just act blindly either. But if we're going to understand why internal framing is so foundational, we have to look at the exact mechanism of why we feel stuck in the first place.
The invisible exhaustion.
Yes, exactly. The source material points to a concept we can call the recognition gap. Anyone listening who has ever tried to build a new habit, whether it's writing a book, getting fit, or just trying to keep the house clean, knows this feeling.
Yeah, the quiet burnout of chronic effort. You do the work, but you feel like you're getting nowhere.
Exactly. But why does that happen biologically? It happens because of how we process our own achievements. We have this tendency to finish a difficult task, and instead of taking a moment to acknowledge it, we immediately move the finish line.
We tell ourselves, well, I should have done that yesterday.
Right, or other people are already doing twice as much. And when you ignore your own effort, you are actually depriving your brain of the dopamine hit that typically follows task completion. Without that chemical reward, your nervous system literally doesn't record the effort.
So it's like you did the work for nothing, neurologically speaking.
Yes, that is the biological root of invisible exhaustion. So the text suggests a highly specific intervention. It's taking a literal 1-second pause after completed a task simply to say, I did that.
Just, I did that.
Yeah. It's not about stroking your ego. It's a physiological necessity. It drops the dopamine, logs the progress, and builds self-respect. And, well, self-respect is the only sustainable fuel for outward behavioral change.
Look, I hear the logic there, but it assumes the brain is this rational actor that just needs a little, chemical encouragement.
I mean, it literally does need chemical encouragement.
Sure, but the brain doesn't actually prioritize your self-respect. It prioritizes energy conservation. It is neurologically wired to prefer the unhappy familiar over the unknown simply because the familiar requires significantly less cognitive load.
Even if the familiar makes you miserable.
Exactly. You can sit there and internally validate your intentions all day long, but internal thoughts alone cannot forge new neural pathways. The text is brutal in its honesty here. It says nothing changes if nothing changes.
But a pause is a change.
A cognitive pause, maybe, but we do not rise to the level of our internal desires or our cognitive reframing. We fall to the level of our structural habits. True transformation requires actionable friction. You have to do something differently, especially when the internal feeling of readiness is entirely absent.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective.
Hold on, let me just finish this point from the material. It gives the rule of committing to just 5 minutes of a difficult task to break the paralysis. You force the behavior, you break the neurological loop, and then, and only then, do the feelings of pride and self-respect follow. The action creates the new pattern, not the pause.
Okay, but if internal framing is as foundational as I'm arguing, Let's test it at the exact moment this battle is fought every day, the moment we wake up.
Ah, the morning routine.
Right. The illusion of the new beginning is fascinating. We go to sleep expecting the calendar to do the heavy lifting for us. Like, we think waking up on a Tuesday suddenly erases Monday's failures.
Which it obviously doesn't.
No, it doesn't. But the mind is incredibly soft and unguarded right after waking up. If you don't deliberately plant a gentle thought in that space, the brain defaults to the unhappy familiar you just mentioned.
Okay, so what's the intervention?
The material offers a brilliant mechanism for this, placing a sticky note by the bed that simply says, "Start soft."
A sticky note. Come on, give me a break.
I'm serious. Yes, a sticky note. Because when you wake up and read that, you are setting a cognitive anchor. You are intentionally dictating the background music of your entire day before the cortisol of morning stress can even spike.
Background music.
Right. Yeah. You are choosing the lens through which you will view the next 16 hours. That internal decision dictates how you interact with every subsequent stressor.
I come at it from a completely different way. That start soft anchor is completely useless if your physical environment is rigged against it.
How so?
Well, you can't just think soft thoughts while your hand is physically reaching for your smartphone on the nightstand. Carrying unfinished thoughts from yesterday isn't just an emotional vulnerability, it is a structural behavioral issue.
But the phone is just a symptom of the anxiety.
In psychology, there's a well-documented phenomenon where unfinished tasks dominate our attention far more than completed ones. The text calls this a failure to close behavioral loops.
Right, the Zeigarnik effect?
Exactly. In plain English, that means you're trying to start a brand new chapter today while your brain is still actively drafting a rebuttal to an email you received yesterday afternoon. Your cognitive RAM is full.
Which is why you need the pause.
No, a new beginning isn't a feeling you can just summon with a piece of paper. It is a structural, physical decision. Real change is the physical choice not to check the phone immediately upon waking.
But if you just restrict the phone without changing the mindset,
If your established habit is to grab the phone and scroll through social media the second your eyes open, that cognitive anchor is obliterated in milliseconds by a flood of external stimuli. You have to change the physical structure of your morning. You have to physically interrupt the familiar loop.
okay, I'll admit, the idea of physically moving the charger across the room and white-knuckling your way to a new habit sounds incredibly practical on paper.
Because it works.
If you force the physical action, yes, the environment changes. But my concern is the collateral damage to the nervous system while you wait for that adaptation to happen.
Collateral damage? That's a bit dramatic.
Is it? Why do we grab the phone in the first place? We grab it because our internal state is craving a cheap distraction from an underlying anxiety. If you simply ban the phone without addressing the internal state, you're just sitting on the edge of your bed, staring at the wall, aggressively wishing you had your phone.
And that's fine for the first few days.
But it's miserable. Without priming the mind with that start soft intentionality, it's just punishment. The cognitive anchor is what changes the nature of the choice from a strict restriction to a genuine preference.
But the white knuckling is precisely the point of intervention. The friction you feel when you stare at the wall instead of your screen is where the neural pathways are actually being rewritten.
I just don't think humans are built to endure friction without meaning.
You're assuming that we need emotional alignment to take positive action, and that is a massive trap. This brings us right to the danger of relying on motivation. The text makes a profound point here. You do not have to feel positive to do something positive.
I agree with that in theory, but
If you wait for your mind to feel soft and unguarded, or for your anxiety to fully subside, you will be waiting forever. Anyone listening who has tried to wait for the right mood to start a difficult conversation knows that mood never comes.
well, sure, pure motivation is fleeting.
Right. Whether it's making your bed, replying to a difficult comment, or doing 5 minutes of language study, the material's ethos is done is better than perfect. The action doesn't require emotional alignment. You act in spite of your internal state.
I get that. I really do. But forcing action without internal recognition leads to a very specific dangerous kind of success.
What's dangerous about getting your life together?
The source material explicitly warns us about highly productive days that leave a person feeling completely empty and hollow. You know these days. You finish every task, you respond to every email, you check every box, and yet at the end of the day you feel like the time didn't even belong to you.
Because you were busy, that's life.
No, because you were merely reacting to external demands. You were functioning as a highly efficient machine, but you weren't actually choosing. Let me give you a better way to visualize this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Forcing action without internal recognition is like pressing the accelerator of a car while the transmission is stuck in neutral. You're burning incredible amounts of fuel, the engine is screaming, you are creating immense heat and friction, but the tires aren't catching the road.
So you're making noise but not moving?
Exactly. You aren't actually going anywhere internally. All you are doing is wearing out the engine. The 1-second pause, the deliberate acknowledgement of your own effort, that is the clutch.
The clutch.
Yes, it's what actually drops the transmission into gear so that the engine's effort translates into forward momentum. Action only has value if your attention is anchored inside the action. Otherwise, you're not building a life. You're just cultivating a highly disciplined form of dissociation.
Okay, dissociation is a very heavy word for just getting your chores done. Doing 5 minutes of a dreaded task isn't dissociation. It's a necessary behavioral intervention.
I think ignoring your internal state is a form of dissociating.
But let's look at your car analogy. Even if you feel like you are in neutral, the biological truth of the effort remains. The external world doesn't care if you felt perfectly present while you paid your bills or did your workout. It just matters that the bills are paid and the muscles were engaged.
But your nervous system cares.
The material notes that the strongest version of you is built in small, unimpressive decisions. Choosing to do the work when it feels absolutely flat and empty is exactly what builds genuine resilience. If you demand that every action feel deeply meaningful and anchored in presence, you are setting an impossible, romanticized standard.
But you're measuring the wrong biological benefit here. You're talking about external output, essentially raw productivity. I'm talking about the survival of the nervous system.
Survival?
Yes. And this brings us to a crucial layer of the material, the blue ocean concept. This is the biological case for being entirely unproductive. Taking that 1-second pause to say, I did that, or simply noticing the sunlight catching the leaves on a tree.
Okay, noticing leaves.
Hear me out. This isn't some productivity hack to trick yourself into doing more work. It is a physiological necessity to calm the amygdala.
Okay, explain that leap. How does noticing sunlight on leaves calm the amygdala?
Because of the modern environment we live in, we are constantly subjected to what the text calls the digital shadow.
Ah, the constant passive comparison.
Exactly. Think about the biological context. For most of human history, you only had to compare yourself to the 50 or so people in your immediate village. If you were decent at your job, you felt secure.
Right. The competition was local.
Today, the moment you open your phone, you are subjected to the passive comparison of the entire top 1% of the entire globe. Even when we aren't actively scrolling, we are burdened by this invisible metric. Our baseline state is one of quiet deficit.
I don't disagree that social media is exhausting.
Right, because our brains process these curated highlight reels not as entertainment, but as our own baseline survival metric. We constantly feel like we are falling behind an invisible tribe, which triggers a low-grade fight-or-flight response.
And how does the pause fix that?
True positivity, as the text defines it, is a pause. It is a moment of stillness that protects us from that exhaustion. It signals to the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, that we are safe in the present moment. Without that internal regulation, your behavioral friction is just pushing an already exhausted system closer to total collapse.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that an internal pause is completely insufficient to protect a nervous system under an active siege?
Insufficient?
Yes. You're talking about signaling safety to the amygdala by noticing the sunlight, which, sounds beautiful. But the text explicitly calls for setting tangible, external boundaries. It talks about saying no to draining conversations.
Well, yes, boundaries are important.
It talks about physically muting stressful notifications and logging out of the apps. Regulating the nervous system fundamentally requires establishing external behavioral borders, not just practicing internal gratitude while the chaos continues around you.
It's not just gratitude, though.
If a toxic dynamic is constantly pulling your energy down, taking a 1-second pause to internally reframe the situation doesn't stop the drain. The boundary is an action. You have to physically interrupt the external loop.
But the physical boundary is entirely secondary. The primary event is the internal cognitive recognition that your energy is precious and actually deserves protection.
I don't think they happen in that order.
Think about how often we fail at setting boundaries. The source material talks about how we say yes when our heart whispers no, simply because we want to be nice, and we end up spending our energy like it's endless.
Sure, people-pleasing is a huge issue.
The behavioral shift only happens when you internally audit your life and realize, wow, this specific habit or this specific relationship leaves me feeling hollow. That is a purely internal cognitive recognition. Once you recognize your own value, muting the notification or walking away is easy.
Is it easy, though?
Well, easier. But if you try to set a behavioral boundary without the internal conviction that your peace is worth protecting, that boundary will collapse the very first time it gets tested.
I disagree that the internal conviction must magically appear first. Many people set boundaries while they are absolutely terrified, feeling deeply unworthy, and like sweating through their shirts.
True, it is scary.
But the very act of setting the boundary, the physical behavioral friction of forcing the word no out of their mouth, is what actually teaches their brain that they have agency. Think about behavioral activation in psychology.
Okay, what about it?
You don't wait to feel better, to do the things you enjoy. You do the things you enjoy to teach your brain how to feel better. The text notes that your actions do not have to match your emotions. You can feel afraid, you can feel like an absolute imposter, and you can still act with strength.
I mean, yes, acting as if is a known strategy.
When you take the physical action to protect your energy, your brain observes that action and updates its internal model. It says, oh, I must be someone whose energy is worth protecting because I just protected it. The action precedes the belief.
But if the brain is constantly moving the standard, as we established it does with the recognition gap, how does it ever register that action without the pause?
It registers the reality of the boundary.
You force the word no, you set the boundary, and immediately your brain rationalizes it away. It says, well, that was just one time, or they probably hate me now. The feeling of empowerment disappears instantly.
That's just the brain resisting the new habit.
You're right back at zero. The physical action is completely erased by the cognitive habit of moving the finish line. That is exactly why the 1-second pause of saying, I am proud of myself for doing that is non-negotiable. Without the internal anchor, your external actions are invisible, even to yourself.
They aren't invisible to your life's trajectory, though. If you wake up, take the stairs instead of the elevator, study a language for 5 minutes instead of scrolling, and physically mute a toxic group chat.
Sure, those are all good things.
Your life is materially, objectively different by 9 a.m., whether your internal critic applauds you or not. You have successfully interrupted the unhappy familiar. You have changed the physical direction of your life.
I just think that's a very mechanical way to live.
And frankly, the insistence on having to feel proud or present can sometimes just become another impossible metric we use to judge ourselves. We end up failing at the task and then failing at feeling good about the task. It's exhausting.
Well, let's pull back and look at where this leaves us in the context of the source material.
Good idea.
My position throughout this discussion has been that without cultivating quiet pride, without that 1-second pause of recognition, and without intentional attention, even the most disciplined actions eventually lead to invisible exhaustion.
And I hear that. I do.
You can force all the new behaviors you want. You can physically move your phone across the room every night. But if you don't shift your internal narrative, you will just be doing new things with the same heavy, critical mind. True, sustainable growth is fundamentally an internal shift. It's about looking at a messy, imperfect effort and having the internal grace to drop the transmission into gear and say, I see what I'm doing and it matters.
And my position remains that because our brains seek the absolute safety of familiar loops and minimal cognitive load, internal desires and mental reframing mean very little without the raw courage to take a small, imperfect action.
The behavior friction.
Yes, a 5-minute timer. A physical choice to put the phone down, choosing not to react when provoked, doing the exact thing you need to do when you least feel like doing it. The brain learns from what we physically repeat in the real world. You don't need a perfectly calibrated mindset to begin again. You just need a single moment where you refuse to repeat the same physical pattern.
Yet, despite the friction between our approaches, I think we've hit upon a pretty profound point of convergence from the material.
I think we have. We both agree on the ultimate stakes of this debate. Life feels incredibly short, not because we actually lack time, but because we lack presence.
Absolutely. The time passes in a blur because we are rarely fully inside of it.
Whether you view the solution as an internal cognitive pause to register the moment or a physical behavioral interruption to break the autopilot, we are both arguing against living in a state of passive default. We are both pointing to the material's profound truth here.
Which is that the strongest versions of ourselves are not built in massive dramatic overhauls.
Exactly. They are built in small, unimpressive, completely ordinary moments of friction.
The moment you choose to stay instead of leave. The moment you start the timer instead of delaying. The moment you pause to acknowledge your own effort. How we think and how we act are locked in this incredibly complex, bidirectional relationship.
It's a chicken and egg scenario, really.
It is. And there is so much more to explore in this source material regarding the hidden costs of our inaction. It leaves all of us with a fascinating question to reflect on tomorrow morning. When you wake up and feel the heavy pull of yesterday dragging you down, well, do you need to rewrite the software of your internal narrative first, or do you just need the physical courage to step out of bed and act anyway?